Welcome to Living the Smarter Science of Slim, where we provide a scientifically proven lifestyle for long-term health and fat loss by eating more and exercising less, but smarter.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that.
Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back with another bonus Smarter Science of Slim podcast. And I'm very, very excited about today's show. We're welcoming back one of the most influential people, certainly in the nutrition world out there. He is an American biochemist who is the Jacob Gould Sherman Professor Emeritus of Nutrition and Biochemistry at Cornell University, the author of the brand new book, Whole, the very well-selling book, The China Study. He's also one of the stars of the documentary Forks Over Knives, and he is the founder of the T. Colin Campbell Foundation, which you can learn more about at tcolincampbell.org. And he is back with us for a second time to talk less about food and more about his experience in the government and in all these institutions that influence how food is given to us, presented to us, marketed to us, and sold to us. Dr. T. Colin Campbell, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Well, Colin, I so appreciate you making the time to chat here. And one of the things that I was so delighted to see after our first show was reactions on the internet about how people were happy to see that we could celebrate our similarities rather than demonizing our differences. In one area I thought we could talk about even more that would celebrate our similarities is just how sick and twisted a lot of the business of food and the government involvement in food has become, because you've had a lot of personal experience there, haven't you?
Yeah, I sure have. I think altogether, I was involved formally in one way or another for about 20 years, either on one kind of expert panel or another, or maybe giving testimony before congressional committees or such like that. Yeah.
And
I saw quite a bit.
So, Colin, can you, if you don't mind, can we just, I think a lot of people are very familiar with your work around food, but are not as familiar. And like you said, you have over 2 decades of experience on the politics of food. So can you take us through a little bit of your experience in that arena and then some of the things you saw which you didn't really care for?
Well, as far as my formal activities were concerned, I was a member of several National Academy committees, that's National Academy of Science committees, having to do with food and food policy. And one of them, probably the most notable one, was a so-called Diet, Nutrition, and Cancer Report of 1982, which was the first, in a sense, formal report on this question concerning diet and cancer that ever had been published. There were 13 of us, and we represented different sort of sub-disciplines of, the nutrition cancer field. That one, actually, when it was submitted and when it was published, actually, was the most sought-after report in the history of the National Academy of Science. It surely generated an enormous amount of publicity and so forth at the time. Prior to that, Senator George McGovern had published on his committee a report having to do with a lower fat diet, less meat, if you will, recommendations or goals, they call them, in regards to heart disease. But that report was, of course, limited to a discussion of heart disease for the most part. Then shortly after that, the Congress was curious about whether those recommendations for heart disease might be similar or different for cancer. And when they invited the chairman of the National Cancer Institute of NIH to give some testimony, Vince DeVita, he put together a draft statement, if you will, sent it to a couple of us to have a look at it. He was kind of informing himself, too, about what the National Cancer Institute was doing. And he admitted, essentially, that NCI of the NIH, essentially, that the Cancer Institute had devoted very little of their funding to the question concerning the role of food in cancer. I think the estimate he had was somewhere around 2 to 3% of the total funding. And that's about right. And in fact, the other NIH institutes also had even less for the most part. So that kind of kicked off their interest in, well, let's learn something about it. when he admitted that NIH wasn't doing much, they then gave, as I recall, it was about $1 million to fund a new study involving an expert panel, and that's what I was on. And we came up with recommendations that were very similar to the recommendations for preventing heart disease. And that, in turn, was really what caught the eye of the public. When you talk about cancer, as you know, it's pretty contentious. And that was one report. The other ones I was on one having to do with the carcinogenicity of saccharin. It was actually prior to that, whether that was really important or not. And there was yet another one on having to do with how do we label, or if, in fact, we should be labeling foods according to their content of toxic agents, especially carcinogenic or cancer-producing agents. Still another had to do with food labeling. That was kind of a big task, too, getting together and doing that. And there were some others that I contributed to, wasn't a member of, but I also was, there was one I was recommendation for research, kind of research should be done, which turned out to be quite significant. And then I was the chief witness to the Federal Trade Commission on their assessment of the early claims about what vitamin supplements might do to prevent cancer and other diseases. That was a 3-year effort in the docket, quite a long time. So those kind of activities and others was my experience. And, those are all very public reports, and they were taken fairly seriously to some extent, at least by policymakers. And
Dr. Campbell, so you mentioned during your experience, you saw that sub 3% of funding was spent on investigating the importance of food in disease states. Were there other things you saw that you almost just had to, rub your eyes and say, is this really, am I really seeing this? Are we really recommending these types of things? Are we really behaving in these types of way?
Yes, it's like there's a bunch of things. I just kind of have to select them out here. If I were to put my finger on one thing, let me just sort of summarize quickly here the kind of things that I think ought to be done that are not now being done. First off, the dietary guidelines that's run by the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, it's actually being run by an agency, the Department of Agriculture, that is livestock-based. That's their main interest by far, insofar as the expenditure of money is concerned for them. And there's a sort of revolving door between the chief people at USDA and the livestock industry, just going back and forth. And so there's a lot of very thick political relationship between the private sector and the public sector in that sense. Especially, it was just troubling for me because regardless of what one's views are about those foods, the fact of the matter is when you have industry people coming in and sort of taking over, then going back to the industry again, I mean, everybody knows about the revolving door, I think. That's a pretty serious bias.
And Colin, I think that's the key point that I'm so glad you bring up, which is regardless of what your position is on what you should or shouldn't be eating, it seems like we can agree that people who make money off of selling certain edible substances should not be on the boards of those who are supposed to be objectively recommending what we should be eating. Absolutely. I feel very strongly about that, especially when those recommendations are for humans, obviously, and for human health, I should say. I mean, some arguments had been made over the years that committee, which incidentally was first formed in 1980. This is following the McGovern Committee report, and then it's done every 5 years since. That committee could be in the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, and that recommendation is made. But there again, there are problems because if it's in health, in that domain, the people who are sitting on these expert panels oftentimes are coming from the pharmaceutical industry. Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, you got people coming from the food industry. In the case of agriculture, in the case of health and human services, too many people have too much relationship with the pharmaceutical industry. So in either case, whether it's the food industry, the drug industry, it's the same sort of phenomenon, the revolving door practice and all the rest of it.
And Colin, is it fair to say that this is not Colin's hypotheses? Like you saw this, you were on these boards, you met these people, you literally watched the revolving door. Is that fair?
Yes, absolutely. And the revolving door is maybe some of the greatest influence comes from a rather subtle kind of influence, but nonetheless very powerful. Let me elaborate just for a second. When these committees are formed, at least in recent years, and maybe the last 10, 15 years, I guess now, when these committees are formed, a chair is first chosen before the members of the committee are appointed. And the chair that is appointed, ought to be a person that's completely free, of any kind of this kind of private sector influence. Unfortunately, in the case of food, the chair, for example, of the Food and Nutrition Board that sets the recommended dietary allowances for nutrients, the chair of that group was arguably one of the most powerful consultants for the dairy industry in the world. And at the same time, he was also the chair of the Dietary Guidelines Committee. And so I don't particularly want to mention his name here. That's not the point. But the fact is that individual then had a major hand in choosing the members of these respective committees. That's where the influence really becomes really pretty serious. Because the people who are chosen for these committees are going to be the people who might be of his persuasion, and certainly of the persuasion of the agency that's organizing this. And I find that very troubling because I had served on a couple of committees, one in particular, a couple of them, I guess, where the chair actually, in one case, was the dean of the University of Virginia Law School. He didn't know much about diet, which we were deliberating at the time, but he was a lawyer, actually. And he was a prominent man, and he knew how to run meetings. He was very, very good. And so I saw that situation where he, in turn, really had a pretty strong hand in running these committees and really operated in a very objective way. I liked it a lot. That was some years ago. And so I have made a recommendation, actually formally, that future chairs of all these committees should be people. They don't have to be people expert in the field. What they have to be is prominent people who know how to run committees and can do this. And then the people who are chosen for the committees ought to be chosen in a way that tends to represent, the various interests, let's say, in science or maybe in the public at large. So that's one thing. And that, as I say, that's kind of a thing that the public tends not to see. The public's not in a business, in a position to know the prejudice and biases of the chairs. And they're not in a business of knowing that these chairs have a lot of influence to choose the members. But I have to tell you, that's a very powerful sort of tool. That's a way of getting your way, if you will.
And Colin, it seems like that is an area that no matter what your nutritional persuasion is, we can all agree and say, it seems like at the end of the day, each of us as individuals really needs to take ownership of our health and what we put in our mouth, because if we absolve that responsibility to some government committee or some advertising agency, they don't have our best interests in mind. Well
put. I totally agree with you.
Excellent. Okay, what's number two? What's number two?
Well, number two is the food subsidy program that the USDA, for the most part, administers. The food subsidies, I should say, come in various forms and through various government agencies and avenues. Largely, in the case of food, it's administered through the USDA, as far as I'm aware. And these are subsidies that tend to support farmers to produce food, obviously. And early on, it was done because our country wanted to have some assurance that farmers were kept whole in a sense, and not suffer the vagrancies of, let's say, the weather patterns and stuff like that. And so it sort of made some sense, I think, initially.
It seems like they had noble motives. Their intentions going were good.
Right. I think so. From my reading of the history, it goes back before my time, but for the most part. But in any case, that whole process, though, then became, in my view, really corrupted, because the amount of money that flows into these various industries or farm groups essentially are going to be subject to political influence big time. I mean, really big time. And so at the present time, for example, about 10% of farmers get somewhere in the neighborhood, last I've heard, about 60 to 70%, the total subsidy. So it's a small group of people, relatively small group of people, getting the majority of the funding. And then you look at the breakdown of where this funding is going to, what kind of foods it's supporting. It turns out, in my view, that 99%, if you can believe it, is actually subsidies that's generated for the dairy and meat industries and also for the grains that's largely fed to livestock production. 1% is for fruits and vegetables. Mm-hmm. Beyond nutrition, I really don't care what one's position might be on this in the final analysis, but I think one would have to agree that is a disproportionate sharing of subsidies.
Oh, Colin, I would agree completely. What I just heard you say is that we have 99% of our originally well-intended government food subsidies going towards monocrops and industrialized large farms, and 1% going to a more nutrient-dense and diverse fruits and vegetable sourcing.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You said it well. So that's another area that I find really serious, in addition to the dietary guidelines and that. A third thing that I would mention from sort of a higher level, sort of 30,000-foot level in a sense, is the fact that the National Institutes of Health, which is the lead biomedical research agency in the world by far, that NIH is actually, it's plural, National Institutes, plural, of Health. They're made up of, now, it's latest count, I think, 28 different institutes and centers and programs. The major ones being the National Cancer Institute, the National Heart, Blood, and Lung Institute, for example, and so forth and so on. They're named pretty much for diseases, but not in all cases. In any case, we had these 28 institutes. And the last time I checked, nutrition is pretty important. In our health.
We can certainly agree on that. I say we get T-shirts made that say nutrition is important.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in this field for many, many years. I certainly think it is, and I think I can defend it. Well, in any case, of the 28 institutes, there's not one that's called the Institute of Nutrition. Mm-hmm. Not one. And I have been really at the center of that debate and that discussion at NIH, because not only was I a recipient of generous amounts of funding for many, many years, mostly from the National Cancer Institute, I also served on the committees that, we call them study sections, served on committees that passed judgment on which kind of research should be done, which kind of applications, for example, that are submitted by other researchers, which kind of applications should be funded. I was on the committees that determine the priority for funding, if you will. And on one occasion, I was the only member of a committee of about 15 on we called them the chemical carcinogenesis study section, having to do with, basic cancer research, which is also my field. I was the only one on there with a background in nutrition. So I was getting most of the applications coming in. I had to participate in all the ones that mentioned anything about nutrition. And I was feeling a little bit overwhelmed in that committee. Good committee, great people, but I said, hey, guys, we ought to organize another committee here, or suggest another committee to be formed that was just focused just on food and cancer, let's say, because it's an emerging field. They all signed the petition. We submitted it forward, went forward. It was approved. Later, but it got a different name. We suggested the Nutrition Cancer Study Section. Later, when I was invited to give this director's seminar, that's just the senior members of the institute, that happened for two different administrations. When I went there, this was after the committee had been formed. I posed a question to the director at the time. I said, why did you change the name? I said, we need attention for nutrition. And he said, oh, we have nutrition in some of the other programs. I said, no, you don't. I said, Vincent DeVita's testimony said we only had 2 or 3%. And most of that's used for clinical trials testing individual nutrients. That's not nutrition. Mm. And I made some comment like that. It did irritate him. He said, well, if you're going to talk that way, you can just get up and go back to Cornell if you want to. We had a bit of a row about it. But, I don't want to make this too negative. But the fact of the matter is, it became clear to me, these were the senior people, and clear to me that there was no intent to actually include nutrition in the discussion concerning the kind of research funding that ought to be given to, how does this work? How does this phenomenon really work? There was just little or no interest. I found that really, really troubling and terribly, terribly important. That somehow it was erased from the priority list of things to do, and it still is.
And Colin, I don't help me. I mean, and maybe you don't understand either, but help me understand. Like, to me, that just is it because food is perceived as such a blunt object? They'd rather focus on more precise measures. I mean, how can some of the smartest medical minds in the world say that which we put into our body every single day is not important to understand?
Yeah, you really said it well. You're going in the right direction, because I mean, obviously, having had these experiences and many others, over time, I became more and more frustrated, with what was really happening, and some of the things that I could see happened at a very high level, and had major influence in terms of shaping, what the research program was really about, and as well as shaping, the practice of medicine, and so forth, and public education policies, and so then. What was your question? I've sort of lost it.
Oh, no problem. Well, just how can, I mean, we must know that on an intuitive level, if taking a pill affects you, taking a food substance into your body affects you. So how can it be ignored? How can't it be taken seriously?
Well, that actually, it's a very important question for me, at least, too, because having had these discussions with these people, having seen these kinds of things, I also was asking the same question. And so that was the genesis, actually, for the second book that I published called Whole. Because in that book, I really wanted to explore this question in some depth, if I could. I don't like the idea of conspiracies. I don't like to talk about conspiracies. Some people say I do, but I don't. I'd rather leave out, the idea that people sitting in a smoke-filled room making decisions to screw the public. That's not my point. But what I had come to believe is that there's a paradigm or worldview of our thinking that probably influences all of us, whether we're in high-level, powerful decision-making positions, or whether we're workers in the system, or whether we're the consuming public. We are living within a paradigm of thinking that probably shapes the views of all of us. And so that was the basis for the book Whole. And it is, I hope it gets some attention, regardless of what people might think on the other end of the spectrum, about what they should put in their mouths. I want them to think about that idea, because therein lies the answer to your question, in my view. We don't understand nutrition, the way it actually works in the body. We too tend to, and we always have, we tend to fund studies for research studies, and we tend to practice in the marketplace our information about nutrition on the basis of individual nutrients. Mm-hmm. It's always been that way. It's a
reductionist approach.
It's a reductionist approach, and that's the way it is. In fact, the whole medical system is that. That's what's wrong with the medical system. That's why it's not working. The medical system is founded on reductionist principles, period. And so, and in order to get a feel for how serious this really is and how wrong it really is, all one needs to do is to crawl inside of a cell. And I spent much of my early career, working sort of at intracellular levels, if you will. And we have about 10 of those things, or 100 trillion, somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't know who counted them, but anyhow, we have a very large number of these cells. And one cell can sit on the head of a pin, and we can't see it. So, a cell is a very, very tiny, tiny thing. It's not visible to the naked eye, for the most part. And within that cell, within those trillions of cells, there's a whole, in each and every cell is a whole universe. And if one applies atomic distances and probabilities of activity, not precise numbers, but probabilities of activity, look at, intracellular atomic distances between things in terms of architecture. If you take that approach and look at a cell, what is this thing? The complexity of the cell is beyond comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost looks like every single cell is like a universe.
Mm-hmm.
Our universe, as we look out, to the skies, for example, we have a sense of what the universe is. It's infinite, it's big, it's so forth and so on. This is almost the same thing for each and every one of these cells. So then that's one observation. And I try to explain, use some examples of that kind of thing. It's really fascinating. And then, and in turn, what one also sees within this extraordinary complexity, this infinite, extraordinary complexity, nonetheless, we see integration of activities. And we can see this kind of thing and get all the evidence for that by simply looking at the way enzymes behave, for example, or the way that, sort of series of enzyme reactions in metabolic schemes, how they all work. And when we start looking at that, oh my God, this is incredible, the way that our cells have been fashioned over time, to create this kind of response. And what's really impressive about this is that each and every cell basically is always trying to create health. It really is. That's the fundamental basis and purpose of a cell, is to create health. Now, all these cells, of course, have specialized functions. We all know that. They have specialized functions, but they draw those the template. They operate on the same template in every cell, namely that being the DNA structure itself, the double helix. And so each and every cell, cluster of cells, doing whatever their favorite thing is. But what they're drawing on is a portion of the DNA genome, if you will, a portion of it to express the kind of proteins they need to do their job. And so here you have this wonderful template that's in all the cells of our body, essentially, almost all, that they can draw on to do their special functions. And they do it in such, these cells, it's hard to describe with words. You just have to realize that in each cell, for example, just to throw a figure out there, something like 1.4 miles of the DNA strand exists in every cell. Mm-hmm. Can you believe that? You see this complexity is beyond comprehensive. We can use some numbers and try to, press us and think about it in that way. But there's more to nutrition than just putting in a single amount of a given nutrient. Mm-hmm. And that's what we do with the nutrient supplement industry. That's what we're doing. We advertise and we say that these nutrients do this, that, and something else. When I use this word nutrient a little bit loosely, by the way, is a lot of chemicals in plants and other substances mm-hmm. that many of which have this nutritional activity or property. So if I may, I just like to use that term nutrient. But there's countless nutrients operating really within the cell. And something is there choosing, how much of each to use and how much enzyme activity is to be created and how these enzyme activities interrelate with each other, and what's the end result. And when one is looking at that, it's a vastly different world of experience. And it's not about doing studies to figure out, how much vitamin C we should take to get it. That's helpful. It's helpful at times. We sort of have to study this complexity, and now that's where our minds work. We're limited in that sense. So it's helpful to do the reductionist kinds of studies to get some feel for what kind of physical chemical property, that these individual chemicals have. And it's from that basis and understanding, the intracellular physiology, from understanding the basic biochemical metabolism scheme and the forces that are at play there, it's understanding that then we can begin to build, through an inductive reasoning process, we can begin to build what the whole is. This is another sort of favorite topic of mine. I argue that, we can do reductionist research. Yes, it's helpful. And even sometimes reductionist research can actually produce something that we can use in the short term and will do some good for us. Aspirin reduces pain, let's say. We know that. So, but that doesn't solve the problem. We're treating symptoms, if you will, mm-hmm. when we take that kind of approach. And so if we go back and look at the fundamentals of what's really going on, one gets an entirely different, then we're in a territory where we're working with nature. We're understanding nature, what nature did. And we can ask some really fundamental questions. And a lot of the debate that we may have, as to what to put in their mouths and so forth and so on, mostly based on empirical data. oftentimes shaped by personal prejudice. This what I'm talking about is another way of looking at the whole question. You can see, yeah.
I was going to say, Colin, what you're saying really resonates with me in the sense that it seems, and I don't want to get too metaphysical here, but it's hard not to when you talk about the almost quantum level of complexity and individual universes that make up these individual cells. And it almost seems like a instance of hubris where we have incredibly smart people who have an incredible amount of pressure put on them to essentially save and preserve life. And to say, I don't have the answer and I haven't identified the precise mechanism. It seems like we almost are putting pressure on these people to be able to give us reductionist answers. And because of that, we've gotten reductionist answers back. And anytime anyone says anything like a holistic nutritionist or a doctor who practices holistic medicine, there's these smirks of quackery, when in reality, to me, that is also just an indication of hubris. It's saying it's like a superiority, I can conquer nature complex. And it seems like what we're talking about here, and also what I celebrate in my work, is not a conquering of the body, not a conquering of nature, but a symbiotic relationship that makes them both thrive. But that's perceived as woo-woo. Well, I disagree with that. I don't think that's woo-woo at all.
Yeah, the nature versus nurture argument, as you know, I mean, that debate's going on since ancient times in various sundry forms. And it's still with us. And you're quite right. The question that can be posed on the basis of what you just said and what I said, I think the question that can be posed is, how did we get so out of whack, in what we do now? And I think this is where, it's some attention to history is really very useful. It has been for me. And to go back and look at, let's say, in my field, the history of protein nutrition, which has been my entire life, actually. And I knew a lot of the key figures for the last 50, 60 years in this field, even before, I guess. But or the history of cancer research. Those two are my favorites and the ones I know best. And I have to tell you that studying the history in some detail, getting to know some of the figures who are actually making the decisions, look at the evolution policies, things like this, it's very rewarding. It's very rewarding. And it's also rewarding. It's rewarding in the sense that it's pretty easy to figure out, why there's so much confusion and why we did this, that, and everything else, and why we got into bad diets, and the ideas come and go all the time. And basically, it's because of our use of reductionist data and the reductionist findings, and somehow believing as we go forward that we just, we might do our little work in a little corner of nature, if you will, and learn quite a bit about it in great detail. But then, unfortunately, some of us go out and, tell everybody else we discovered the world. I mean, that's what happens. And so it does lend itself, this kind of thing, it lends itself for people to choose which of these details they like. And they choose the details they like based on a lot of personal sort of background that they have. And so I think that is really the source of much of the confusion in the public mindset too, is that we got so many details now. I mean, you know this as well as I do. You can go to PubMed, which is the collection of the National Library of Medicine, research reports. I mean, what are we at? Millions. Really seriously, 3 or 4 million peer-reviewed papers. We can find anything in there we want to find. If we're talking about details, and we can put it together and make ourselves a little puzzle and say, hey, we got the answer, kind of thing. Or we can take the details and talk about the details all by ourselves and talk about the wondrous things that some of these things do. It's crazy. It really is. It's crazy. And I think it would bear fruit, no pun intended, if we just sit back and start to think a little bit about history and philosophy, in the context of what we're trying to understand about health and nutrition. It's quite a lot of good stuff there.
I I couldn't agree more, Colin. That's some of my formal university training is in the field of philosophy, and I got to tell you, thinking in that context has sometimes been a little bit more helpful than just reading 100 more clinical research studies.
Right. It is. You got to be careful, and how we have to be careful. We have to be introspective.
Yep.
And self-correcting. As we go forward and read this stuff. Because we can end up with all kinds of ideas. And one of the pieces of gravity in this whole thing is money. Let's face it. It's the lure of getting money, either directly or indirectly, and that's just the way it is.
Yep, selling simple, perishable foods, whole foods. There's really not a lot of money in that. It's kind of a pain to do. So we're fighting an uphill battle, sadly.
Right. It is. It's a tough sell.
Well, Colin, thank you so much. This has been just delightful. I think it is another wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your time with us once again. Well,
thanks so much, and if you might send me a copy of this or tell me where I can see it, get it, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely, Colin. Well, folks, his name is T. Colin Campbell, who you've undoubtedly heard of before today's show. You can learn more about him at his not-for-profit website, tcolincampbell.org, and his new book, Whole, just came out. And remember, this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Talk with you soon.
Wait, don't stop listening yet. If you like the podcast and if there's other ways we can help you, please join us in the Smarter Science of Slim support group, which is freely available at the Smarter Science of Slim website, smarterscienceofslim.com. There you'll find all kinds of free recipes and success stories and just all kinds of fun stuff, like how to help your kids go sane and just great community content.
And just one last thing before you go, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes and up onto Amazon.com and leaving us a review, and then going over to Facebook and liking us, we would hugely appreciate it.